If you've been craving a modern Lord of the Flies set in a Disney World style theme park with World War Z's oral history narrative structure, then boy do I have the book for you. Today we're talking about FantasticLand by Mike Bockoven, a book that's been recommended to me a ridiculous number of times, especially on horror forums and Reddit threads. Now, I finally picked it up and read it last weekend. Despite loving the premise, I had some issues with how it played out. So, let's get into it. The story is presented as an investigative report composed of interviews with survivors and witnesses of the FantasticLand massacre. See, a massive hurricane devastates Florida, leaving FantasticLand, which was a once thriving theme park, completely cut off from the outside world. The park's management had an emergency plan in place, just not a very good one. A group of employees, mostly young adults in their late teens and early 20s, would stay behind to protect the property, secure supplies, and wait for rescue. Seems straightforward, right? Except rescue never comes. Weeks go by, communication with the outside world is severed, and whatever trust or structure these employees had quickly disintegrates. By the time authorities do arrive, 5 weeks later, they don't find a group of exhausted but relieved survivors. They find horror. They find heads on spikes, bloodied bodies, human remains littering the park's once cheerful gift shops, and makeshift banners claiming territories. See photos and videos of the carnage leak online and go viral, shocking the world. How did a group of regular employees, just kids really, descend into this kind of savagery so quickly? See, the survivors splintered into factions, each ruling different sections of the park with his own brutal code. You had the pirates, the shop girls, the Deadpools, the freaks, and the mole people. That one gets me every time. Each tribe had its own leaders, its own rules, its own way of surviving. But surviving soon turned into something else entirely. Warfare, execution, power struggles, and the kind of atrocities that make you question how thin the line between civilization and chaos really is. Through the interviews, we piece together what really happened, or at least what some of the survivors claim happened. Because here's the thing. Everyone has their own version of events. Some blame the hurricane, others blame the park's management, some say the factions were inevitable. But then there are those who claim the biggest villain of all wasn't a person, but the influence of modern culture itself. They blame the way social media, manufactured identities, and the constant need for validation shaped these people long before the storm ever hit. At its core, FantasticLand is an exploration of what happens when you strip away societal norms and force people to rebuild from the ground up. What holds them together? What drives them apart? And more disturbingly, how much of what happened was survival instinct, and how much of it was a choice? Because if there's one thing this book makes clear, is that some people liked what they became. This book does a lot of things really well. First, the oral history format can work for horror. There's an initial tension in piecing together events from conflicting accounts, and that sense of unreliable narration adds a layer of mystery to what actually happened in FantasticLand. There are moments where it shines, particularly in the later part of the book, but as a storytelling device, it wore out its welcome for me fairly quickly. I think this could have worked so much better if the interviews were interspersed with more traditional narrative. Something to ground the reader in the moment instead of always hearing about the events after the fact. It's one thing to hear someone describe a brutal act of violence, but it's another to be inside that moment, feeling the tension, the fear, and the slow unraveling of humanity in real time. Instead, we're always at a distance, getting secondhand information filtered through biased perspectives. It creates a disconnect that makes it harder to feel the stakes the way that you would in a more immediate scene-driven style. I had a similar issue with World War Z, so maybe it's just a personal preference, but I found myself wishing for at least some sections where we drop directly into the chaos rather than being told about it afterward. And with how fast things spiral out of control, I think seeing some of those pivotal moments firsthand would have made the entire breakdown of civilization feel more believable. But for the actual horror itself, Bockoven does not hold back. There are some truly gruesome, disturbing scenes, like people being hunted, ritualistic murders, and the psychological unraveling of the survivors. It's bleak, and what really got to me was the sense of inevitability. You can see the downward spiral happening, and yet, even knowing how bad it's going to get, it still shocks you when it finally does. One of my favorite parts of the book, hands down, is anything involving the warthogs. They're this shadowy, almost mythical presence in the story, built up slowly, always lurking in the background, until suddenly, they aren't just background noise anymore. They go from whispers and rumors to an immediate, tangible threat. And by the time you really see what they're capable of, it's too late. The whole sequence with Jason trapped in a hotel and being hunted by them, genuinely terrifying. That's where the interview format actually works to its advantage, because you're getting the story after it happened, but you're also in Jason's head as he recounts every moment of his fear, his exhaustion, and his desperation to survive. Bockoven's slow introduction of the warthogs makes them feel almost supernatural before grounding them in reality, and it's some of the best horror writing in the book. But then we get to the big issue. The descent into savagery happens way too fast. In Lord of the Flies, you understand the psychological and societal breakdowns that push the kids into barbarism. You see the slow erosion of morality, the gradual shift from civilization to chaos. In FantasticLand, it feels like these employees go from, we should work together and wait to be rescued, to, let's murder each other for sport in like 2 days. I get that the book wants to make a statement about modern day tribalism, the way social media encourages factionalism, performative violence, and the idea that identity is something you craft and display rather than something inherent. But it doesn't entirely sell it in a believable way. There's a massive leap from we're scared and hungry to we're now warriors fighting for dominance. And I kept feeling like we were missing the gradual descent into madness that would have made it feel just more natural. And then there's the bias. Since the story is told through interviews, you'd expect conflicting narratives. And while there is some of that, it still feels like the book is trying to push you toward a particular interpretation. Mainly that the pirates and their leader, Brock Hockney, were the ultimate villains, while the shopgirls and the Deadpools were just somehow less terrible. But when you start looking at the gaps in the story, the things left unsaid, you realize that there's a lot of moral grayness that isn't fully explored. For example, the shopgirls are portrayed as just ruthless enough to be intimidating, but not so violent that the story condemns them the way that it does the pirates. The Deadpools, who had more chaotic and unpredictable energy, also seem to get off lighter in the retelling. And yet when you really start breaking down who was left alive to tell the story and what they chose to emphasize, you start to realize that maybe the entire narrative we've been given is just kind of skewed. The book hints at this idea that history is written by the victors, that we're not getting the full picture, but it never fully commits to exploring it. And that's frustrating. That's the real missed opportunity of FantasticLand. The book wants you to question the reliability of its narrators, but it doesn't give you enough perspectives to do so in a satisfying way. It's a story that's begging for a deeper dive into moral ambiguity, into how propaganda shapes history, into how people justify their own actions in the aftermath of horror. Instead, it stops just short, leaving you with a story that almost delivers on a potential, but holds back just enough to feel incomplete. And this brings me back to my original issue. The book needed more. More perspectives, more depth, more room to really explore why these people turned on each other instead of just giving us the aftermath. There's so much good here, but it feels like we're only scratching the surface of what could have been an incredible horror novel. If you like Lord of the Flies and Battle Royale, or you're into horror stories that explore the breakdown of society, then FantasticLand is absolutely worth checking out. The structure is engaging, the horror is brutal, and the mystery of how things spiraled is compelling enough to keep you turning pages. But if you're looking for deep character studies or a survival story that methodically explains how these people go from normal to monstrous, this might leave you wanting more. The biggest flaw of the book is that it needed to be longer. More perspectives, more interviews with the same people over time, and a clearer sense of that escalation. It's all kind of missing. The book is just over 260 pages, and honestly, it could have used another 100 to really flesh out the devolution into chaos. Also, if you're not a fan of open-ended storytelling, this might frustrate you. There's a lot of ambiguity, a lot of unanswered questions, and while that's intentional, I think it could have been handled in a way that felt more satisfying rather than just incomplete. So, final verdict, I liked it, but I wanted more. And while the oral history format limited the stories in some ways, especially when we didn't get follow-ups with certain survivors or deeper looks into how these factions actually functioned, it was a fun read. Or as fun as you can get when people are being massacred. And I just have to reiterate, Bockoven can write horror. Some of the most unsettling moments I've read in a while came from this book, and I'll absolutely be checking out more of his work. And come to think of it, FantasticLand would make for a really interesting one-off series on HBO or Netflix. Each chapter almost reads like a standalone episode of a TV show. Now, if you've enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends, your family, and even your enemies. Just no psychos wearing pig masks. Or actually, any psychos for that matter. And of course, if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button because every subscriber inches me one step closer to taking over the galaxies. Until next time, take care, keep reading, and I'll see you in the next one.